We now have not only travelled through the land of pure understanding, and carefully inspected each part of it, but we have also surveyed it, and determined the place for each thing in it. This land, however, is an island, and enclosed in unalterable boundaries by nature itself. It is the land of truth, a charming name, surrounded by a broad and stormy ocean, the true seat of illusion, where many a fog bank and rapidly melting iceberg pretend to be new lands, and ceaselessly deceiving with empty hopes the voyager looking around for new discoveries, and twine him in adventures from which he can never escape, and yet also never bring to an end. I mean, when Kant wants, he can write prose that is otherwise than academic and dry. This third chapter of the Analytic of Principles, on the ground of the distinction of all objects in general into phenomena and noumena, is in an important sense a transition towards the dialectic that is going to follow, the transcendental dialectic. So a transition from the analytic to the dialectic. The dialectic is going to be concerned with precisely this broad and stormy ocean, the true seat of illusion. And it's going to explain to us some of the illusions that human reason naturally falls prey to. These are not just mistakes. These are illusions that are sort of inherent in human reason itself. But before we go there, Kant sort of takes a step back to take stock of what we have learned in the analytic and how this teaches us to think about the realm of all thought, or the realm of all discovery, this entire world where thinking can attempt to get knowledge, even though it can only succeed on this one particular island. Now, as the title of the third chapter suggests, on the ground of the distinction of all objects in general into phenomena and noumena, Kant is going to talk about noumena. Right? He already talked about phenomena. He didn't really use the word phenomenon that much, I would say, in the analytic. Like, strictly speaking, an appearance is something that has not yet been referred to a determinate object, and once we have done that, once we conceive of it as a particular determinate object under the categories, then it is a phenomenon. But Kant has been using these terms more or less interchangeably, right? So most of the time when Kant was talking about appearances, we could have read him as talking about phenomena. And so that has sort of been dealt with, but what about noumena? What are noumena? And by the way, how do noumena relate to the thing in itself, or things in themselves? And to another term that we have met earlier on, the transcendental object is X, of which I have said at that point that maybe we should think of it not so much as the transcendental object, but as the object transcendentally considered or transcendentally conceived. Well, those are the kinds of questions. Those are the kinds of terms and the kinds of questions that Kant wants to enlighten us about here in this third chapter. So let us look what he says. You know, the chapter sort of starts out relatively slowly by saying, well, you know, this is what we've learned, and there's this realm of illusion, and, now we can also explain to people why they have to suffer through the entire critique of pure reason, because if you don't do that, if you don't do any transcendental investigation, if you don't do the project of the critique, but just embark on some empirical thinking, you don't get the right kind of justification, right? So at A238, Kant tells us that the understanding occupied merely with its empirical use, which does not reflect on the sources of its own cognition, may get along very well, but cannot accomplish one thing, namely determining for itself the boundaries of its use and knowing what may lie within and what without its whole sphere. And then he says, well, that means that it is never sure of its claims and its possession. So by coming to the conclusion that the only objective use of our understanding, the only use of our understanding that can lead to cognition is the empirical use, that doesn't mean that that's the only use that we should make of the understanding, because we also need this transcendental philosophical project, because that will teach us the boundaries of the use of our understanding. And by teaching us the boundaries, it will justify the use within the bounds, right? The use that we actually ought to make of it will be justified in that way. And that surely Kant suggests is something that everybody should be interested in. Okay. Kant goes on to tell us that we don't really even, we can't even really define any concepts without relating them to sensibility. And so, for instance, here's what he says, and this is at B200, it's at B300, okay, it's at B300 according to this copy. It's at A242. Now, I'm a bit surprised because it says B300 two times in my margin, and so I wonder whether that's correct. At A242, and slightly before that, Kant says the following. He says that the fact that we didn't give a full definition of the categories way back in the metaphysical deduction was in part because we didn't need to, and not needing to, okay, why should we embark on this extra work where we might, who knows, make some mistakes or at least confuse the issue by doing things that aren't necessary. But that was not the only reason to not give definitions of the categories way back in the metaphysical deduction. But now it turns out that the ground of this precaution lies even deeper, namely that we could not define them even if we wanted to. Right? We could not define them even if we wanted to, but rather if one does away with all conditions of sensibility that distinguish them as concepts of a possible empirical use, and takes them for concepts of things in general, thus of transcendental use, then that is to do nothing more than to regard the logical functions of judgments as the condition of the possibility of things themselves, without in the least being able to show whence they could have their application and their object. Thus, how in pure understanding, without sensibility, they could have any significance and objective validity. Right, so you will remember that we got the pure categories back in the metaphysical deduction, and then later on in the schematism chapter, we were taught the schematized versions of those categories. And now what Kant is insisting on is that when we wonder how to apply categories, when to apply categories to objects, how to know which categories can with justice be applied to which objects, well, we have an answer about the schematized categories and the objects of perception. We have an answer there. We know how to do that. We know that they, in a sense, always apply, and we know how they apply. That's what the system of principles has just taught us. But the unschematized categories, which would have to apply to things that are not sensible, right? We have no idea of the justice of doing anything like that. Right? We cannot give any story about how they would apply to objects, what objects they would apply to, when we would be justified in doing that, and so on and so forth. And so in a very real sense, we don't even really know how to use those concepts, how to use the unschematized categories, except in a sort of merely logical sense. Right? We sort of understand them, we can reason with them a little bit, but we can't really apply them, we can't really use them to get to the level of cognition. And so here we see once again Kant insisting that we do not know how to apply these elements of thinking outside the realm of possible experience. Okay, so let's go to the, I would say, most important part of the chapter, which starts a little bit later. So I am now at A246, which is B303, the beginning of B303. Here's what Kant says there. He says, now from this it follows irrefutably that the pure concepts of the understanding can never be of transcendental, but always only of empirical use, and that the principles of pure understanding can be related to objects of the senses only in relation to the general conditions of a possible experience, but never to things in general, without taking regard of the way in which we might intuit them. So this is more or less what I was already explaining. One thing I want to add is that in this entire chapter, Kant is going to use the word transcendental in a way that sometimes is a little bit, I would say, a little bit ill-advised. Kant is not making his careful distinction between transcendental and transcendent here. And so when Kant talks here of a transcendental use, he generally means using concepts, applying them to objects that are not objects of possible experience. So applying them to objects that are objects of pure thought, rather than objects of sensible experience. So that's what Kant here means with transcendental use. Now, there's another sense of transcendental use, I guess, which is using them in transcendental philosophy. And of course, all these concepts that he's talking about are crucial in transcendental philosophy, which is why they have a central place in the critique of pure reason. So it's good to keep these two things in mind. There's transcendental philosophy, and these concepts have a use there, but they don't have a use in application to concepts outside the bounds of possible experience. So this is what the transcendental analytic has done according to Kant. Its principles are merely principles of the exposition of appearances, and the proud name of an ontology which presumes to offer synthetic a priori cognitions of things in general in a systematic doctrine must give way to the modest one of a mere analytic of the pure understanding. So here Kant is saying what philosophers thought they were doing when they were doing ontology, like telling us about the nature of things in general. Nope. All we can do is the analytic of the pure understanding. Again, this is sort of reiterating the basic message of the critical system. Thinking is the action of relating given intuitions to an object. If the manner of this intuition is not given in any way, then the object is merely transcendental, and the concept of the understanding has none other than a transcendental use. But the merely transcendental use of the categories is in fact no use at all, or as Kant adds in the second edition, no use at all for the cognition of anything. Okay. Then at A249, and here the A edition and the B edition have different texts, and I'm going to mostly follow the A edition, but I will bring in a passage from the B edition a little bit later on, because there Kant very helpfully distinguishes between, on the one hand, a positive and on the other hand a negative sense of the concept of a noumenon, which is a word that we haven't really seen before, right? So Kant is going to introduce something new. Here's where it happens, A249. Appearances, to the extent that as objects they are thought in accordance with the unity of the categories, are called phenomena, or phenomena, I guess, given the Greek spelling here. If, however, I suppose there to be things that are merely objects of understanding, and that nevertheless can be given to an intuition, although not to sensible intuition, then such things would be called noumena. Right? So noumena are things given in intellectual intuition, in non-sensible intuition. Phenomena are the things given in sensible intuition. Noumena are the things given in non-sensible intuition. And now one thing that we should be aware of is that Kant doesn't believe that the concept of a noumenon is contradictory or anything like that. Right? On the contrary, I mean, it's even useful to talk in terms of noumena. In fact, Kant's going to say that it's necessary to talk in terms of noumena in transcendental philosophy, right? In order to draw the boundary between what we can have cognition about and what we can't have cognition about, Kant seems to be saying it has to be possible to talk about both sides of the boundary, right? We need to be able to talk about, in order to make a distinction between the justified use of the understanding in the empirical world, when it comes to possible appearance, possible experience, and the illegitimate use of the understanding outside of the bounds of all possible experience, it had better be the case that we can talk cogently about both sides of this boundary, because otherwise, how could we draw it? So this is in fact a topic that, let me check in my bookcase, a topic that exercises Adrian Moore a lot in his brilliant book, The Evolution of Modern Metaphysics, Making Sense of Things. One of the main themes, maybe the main theme of which is this idea of a boundary between what can be thought and what cannot be thought. Okay, Kant apparently thinks that we can draw both sides of the boundary. We can talk about both sides of the boundary. Famously, Wittgenstein in the Tractatus is going to say something else. He's going to say that whatever lies outside the boundary, and it's a different boundary from Kant's maybe, but whatever lies outside of the boundary cannot be talked about at all. We can only draw the limit from the inside. Okay, I don't know whether that is possible, but that's the kind of philosophical theme that these pages touch on, even though, of course, Kant is not going to talk about how he relates to Wittgenstein. That would be pretty amazing if he could do that. So, Kant goes on and says, now one might have thought that the concept of appearances, limited by the transcendental aesthetic, already yields by itself the objective reality of the noumena and justifies the division of objects into phenomena and noumena, thus also the division of the world into a world of the senses and a world of the understanding. For, a little bit later on, for if the senses merely represent something to us as it appears, then this something must also be in itself a thing, and an object of a non-sensible intuition, that is, of the understanding. That is, a cognition must be possible in which no sensibility is encountered, and which alone has absolutely objective reality, through which, namely, objects are represented to us as they are, in contrast to the empirical use of our understanding, in which things are only cognized as they appear. And so what Kant is suggesting here is that by merely talking about appearances, he seems to be committed to the idea of things that appear and which are in some sense maybe falsified in the appearance, which are not shown to us as they really are. And if that is so, then presumably, we are committed to, first of all, the existence of those things, but also the ability to think about those things, right? I mean, they are part of our theory. And Kant isn't actually going to really reject this, but Kant is going to sort of reinterpret reinterpret it and give us a very specific story about that. Okay, so let's read on. And now I am halfway on A250. So here's what Kant says. All our representations are in fact related to some object through the understanding. And since appearances are nothing but representations, the understanding thus relates them to something, as the object of sensible intuition. But this something is to that extent only the transcendental object. This signifies, however, a something is X, of which we know nothing at all, nor can know anything in general, in accordance with the current constitution of our understanding, but is rather something that can serve only as a correlate of the unity of apperception for the unity of the manifold in sensible intuition. This transcendental object cannot even be separated from sensible data, for then nothing would remain through which it would be thought. It is no object of cognition in itself. So here the transcendental object reappears, and again, the transcendental object is merely the transcendental thought of an object, right? It is merely that in thinking about appearance, we need to posit a completely unspecified something of which it is the appearance. It is sort of the unity, the objective unity, of which all the appearances are, appearances. If there were no appearances, we wouldn't even have this. We wouldn't even need this thought, right? There wouldn't even be anything to think here. This is something that is merely thought as that which unifies the appearances, as that underlying unification, objective unification of the appearances. We can't know anything about it. We can't really say anything about it. It plays an important role in Kant's critical system, but it's not an intellectual object that we can have purely intellectual knowledge about. Right? It's in a sense not even an object at all. It's more like the thought or concept of an object. Just for this reason, then, the categories do not represent any special object given to the understanding alone, but rather serve only to determine the transcendental object, that is, the concept of something in general, through that which is given in sensibility, in order thereby to cognize appearances empirically under concepts of objects. Okay, so why do we nevertheless want to talk about noumena? And what are those noumena? Let's read on. But the cause on account of which, not yet satisfied through the substratum of sensibility, one must add noumena that only the pure understanding can think to the phenomena, rests solely on this. Sensibility and its field, namely that of appearances, are themselves limited by the understanding, in that they do not pertain to things in themselves, but only to the way in which, on account of our subjective constitution, things appear to us. This was the result of the transcendental aesthetic, and it also follows naturally from the concept of an appearance in general, that something must correspond to it, which is not in itself appearance. And so what Kant is insisting on here is that appearance already indicates a relation to something, the immediate representation of which is sensible, but which in itself must be something independent of sensibility. So Kant insists and agrees that in the very notion of an appearance lies the idea of something that appears and which cannot be identified with the appearance, and therefore cannot be identified with the phenomenon, which is the appearance, right? Which is the determinate version of the appearance. Okay, so what is this noumenon? Well, whenever we have this object of sensation or object of possible experience, we have to think of it as the appearance of something, right? As something that is not itself sensible, that is not itself available for sensibility. And that idea is the idea of something that could only be thought, right? That could only be thought as it is, not as it appears to us. Right? So an object that is purely intellectual and not sensible. From this arises, Kant says, the concept of a noumenon. That is this concept. The object that can only be thought. It's an object of thought, of intellectual intuition, not of sensible intuition. Which, Kant goes on to say, however, is not at all positive and does not signify a determinate cognition of any sort of thing, but rather only the thinking of something in general, in which I abstract from all form of sensible intuition. But in order for a noumenon to signify a true object, to be distinguished from all phenomena, it is not enough that I liberate my thoughts from all conditions of sensible intuition, but I must in addition have ground to assume another kind of intuition than this sensible one. Okay, so can I claim that there are noumena? Well, I need the concept of a noumenon, Kant seems to be saying, in a sort of negative sense. Because what I want to say is that the categories don't apply to noumena. And what I want to say is that the objects that appear to me are not noumena. And I want to say all those kinds of things, right? And that's important, and that is why I need the concept of noumenon in order to, in a sense, really in order to express my transcendental philosophy. But that is a merely negative conception of noumenon. So let's look at the B edition here. This is B307. If by a noumenon we understand a thing insofar as it is not an object of our sensible intuition, because we abstract from the manner of our intuition of it, then this is a noumenon in the negative sense. But if we understand by that an object of a non-sensible intuition, then we assume a special kind of intuition, namely intellectual intuition, which however is not our own, and the possibility of which we cannot understand, and this would be the noumenon in a positive sense. Right? So, on the one hand I can think about things not as they are given to us, right? And I need that thought. I need that thought in order to explicate transcendental idealism. But on the other hand, I can think of things as they are given in a non-sensible way, right? So the distinction here is between not being given in a sensible way and being given in a non-sensible way. And the negative conception of a noumenon is the idea of an object that is not given in a sensible way, and that plays a role in transcendental philosophy. But of course, nothing is given there, right? That's precisely what we're talking about, that it's not being given in a certain way, which means that it's not really an object, right? It's not the kind of thing that I can now have knowledge about. If there were things that are given in a non-sensible way, well, then they would be given, right? They would be given to pure thought. I could have knowledge about them. I could, who knows, right? Set up this traditional ontology about them. That is the positive conception of the noumenon. And that, of course, is something that Kant not only doesn't need, but also doesn't want, because that really does not fit the critical philosophy at all. The object to which I relate appearances in general, back in A253, the object to which I relate appearance in general is the transcendental object, that is, the entirely undetermined thought of something in general. This cannot be called the noumenon, for I do not know anything about what it is in itself, and have no concept of it, except merely that of the object of a sensible intuition in general, which is therefore the same for all appearances. So, a little bit later on, Kant tells us that the concept of a noumenon is merely a boundary concept, in order to limit the pretension of sensibility, and therefore only of negative use. So, that is noumenon and the positive and negative noumenon. And now one thing further that we might want to know is, okay, but how does all of that relate to the concept of a thing in itself? Right? How does all of that relate to the concept of a thing in itself? Here is, I think, the way to understand that. So the thing in itself is the thing considered apart from sensibility. Right? If I think about things in themselves, I'm thinking about things as they are apart from the, from whatever our sensibility makes them be. The noumenon, this positive conception of the noumenon, is when I think of things as they are given to an intellectual intuition. Now, if something is given to intellectual intuition, then it is clearly given apart from our forms of sensibility. And so what would be given in intellectual intuition is definitely a thing in itself. Right? So if there are positive noumena, that is, things that are given to us in intellectual intuition, then those things would be things in themselves, right? Things considered apart from sensibility. But we can deny the existence of noumena in the positive sense. We can deny that anything is given in intellectual intuition without denying the existence of things in themselves. And in fact, this is precisely what Kant does. Kant says, well, there are no noumena in the positive sense, or at least, like, we don't even know whether intellectual intuition is possible. So we definitely can't claim that there are any noumena in the positive sense. But Kant definitely claims that there are things in themselves, or at least he talks a lot about the existence of repeatedly about the existence of things in themselves. And here the thing in itself is, it is, like, its existence seems to be sort of beyond doubt. It is when we think of appearances, like of something that appears, we are clearly thinking those things under the conditions of our sensibility. And of course, we could also think those things apart from the conditions of sensibility, right? And then we are thinking them as things in themselves. And, like, we can't really say anything more about that, and that's okay, as when we have done the when we have gone through the critique of pure reason, that is the point where we want to be, right? Where we know that we can't say anything about things in themselves. But you can't really say that things in themselves don't exist, right? I mean, because the difference between the thing in itself and the appearance seems to be a different way of considering sort of the same thing. And the existence of one and the existence of the other doesn't really, I mean, you can't really pry them apart. So when I say that there are no positive noumena, I'm saying that nothing is given to me in a certain, namely intellectual way. If I were to say that there are no things in themselves, then at least on the way that I understand transcendental idealism, that would be an almost nonsensical statement, right? It would be like saying that there are no cows considered aesthetically. I mean, there are cows, and so you can consider them in certain ways. There are appearances, and of course, I mean, it's sort of, given that an appearance is a thing considered under the conditions of sensibility, like, as a sort of immediate implication of that, I can also consider those things apart from our conditions of sensibility, even though that doesn't really, give me anything. It doesn't really mean anything. So, the thing in itself, I would say, is very, very close to the idea of the negative noumenon. It's not the same thing as the idea of the positive noumenon. All right. So that is on the ground of the distinction between phenomena and noumena. And there is one further part of the analytic, which is the amphiboly of the concepts of reflection, in which Kant is going to talk about a certain set of concepts that we might think are very important to philosophy, but which he hasn't really paid any attention at all yet. And those would be concepts like identity and difference, which play an incredibly important role in the philosophy of Leibniz and rationalism in general. And Kant's project in the amphiboly is going to be to explain why Leibniz's use of those concepts to draw philosophical conclusions is wrong and how the critical system shows it to be wrong.